Mr. TAIWO OYEDELE is PwC Partner, West Africa Tax Leader, and President, Impact Africa Foundation, an author, a public speaker and thought leader on business, accounting and tax matters. He has delivered hundreds of presentations and speeches at local and international conferences. He writes articles in Business Day and The Guardian newspaper and grants regular interviews on radio and TV, including Channels Television and CNBC Africa. TAIWO is very active on social media and runs a blog with over 10,000 followers in more than 20 countries. He is a member of the Ministerial Committee on the Implementation of Nigeria's National Tax Policy and a member of the Working Group on Voluntary Assets and Income Declaration Scheme. Ladies and gentlemen, make welcome to GPAD 2021, Mr. TAIWO OYEDELE.
Thank you. Welcome, TAIWO. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Faith. If the host can please allow me to share my screen. He's saying that the host disabled participants sharing screen. While we're waiting for that, let me say a very good morning, good afternoon, evening to everyone, wherever they may be joining this conference from, and to really appreciate my brother, Timi, for this excellent initiative, and to the team supporting him with this, and for everyone who I would call the friend of Africa. So yes, now I can share my screen. So my presentation today is going to be brief. 1 second, so I just project. Okay. So I'm going to be speaking about taxation, governance, and sustainable development in Africa. And the primary objective of this conversation is for those of us who are to just remind ourselves of the realities and what we can do in only 2 ways to contribute. And then to the friends of Africa, who are either on the planet trying to support 1 or 2 initiatives, thanks to Stefan and other people, international organizations and investors who are looking for both opportunities to help, but also to earn returns. So it's good to always share the story from the African perspective. So the agenda I have briefly is to look at the state of African states, and then we look at taxation, governance, and development. And then we connect the dots, and I'll share my final thoughts and next steps. So many African countries, and everybody knows this so well, rely heavily on natural resources as the mainstay of the economy. While this in itself is not a bad thing, it does mean that African countries are exposed to vulnerabilities because they have to rely on whatever is happening in the rest of the world to drive their economies. And whenever there's an economic shock like the COVID-19 pandemic, it will then impact on economic activities, and therefore the consumption and demand for those natural resources will dwindle, and that will create a lot of impact. First, it will be the dollar scarcity. I use dollar now in the sense that it's the most widely needed foreign currency in Africa, but this is just about foreign currencies. Once you have this scarcity, many African countries depend a lot on importation. Even when they are producing, they have to import raw materials and equipment. And because of that scarcity, you then find devaluation of the local currency. And in many cases, that will lead to imported inflation, because whatever you were buying for $10 before might still be $10, but when you convert it to your local currency, it could be easily double digits, growth or inflation, impacting therefore the livelihood and the standard of living of the people on the continent. So we saw the examples during the coronavirus hasn't gone away. We saw many of the countries went into recession, including Angola, Nigeria, South Africa, Zambia actually struggled up to the point where they had to default on the payments of their debt. Now, for example, Nigeria relies on petroleum to provide about 70% of government revenue and foreign exchange receipts. For Zambia, it's copper up to about 80% of the earnings. Even though Africa, in terms of population, accounts for over 15% of the global population, but in terms of contribution towards trade, it's only about 3%, because this is mostly primary products. So if you just rely on natural resources and primary products, there's not a lot of value added. What that means is, the people of the continent are therefore not empowered, and they are unable to extract maximum value from their efforts. However, we have a few markets where things seem to be, at least for some period of time, in the past few years, things were fairly okay, including, and then GDP growth rates was robust. Tanzania, Rwanda, Ethiopia until recently, and it's very unfortunate about the conflict that is going on in Ethiopia. And we do hope that all of these, and Ethiopia, by the way, is the second most populous country in Africa next to Nigeria. So it is important. Now, for there to be development, you need investment. This investment needs to come from domestic investors, it needs to come from foreign investors, it needs to come from governments, it needs to come from multilateral agencies, and we just need investments, and more investments. Africa is the most youthful continent in the world. I think average age is about 19 years. So what that means actually is that Africa is the future of the world, right? If you're most youthful, whether that future of the world will be bright or whether it will be bleak has a lot to do with Africa. So Africa is so important to the future of our planet that we cannot ignore the continent. We've seen major MDI, that's foreign direct investment, in certain sectors, including infrastructural development, technology, manufacturing, healthcare, and agriculture. But I would say these are just not enough. We need more. Major partners in terms of other countries, China, and of course, many people have question marks about that, United States and France. UK used to be a big time partner for Africa in the past, but it seems to be no longer the case. And I do hope that this can be resuscitated. And top markets include Nigeria, Egypt, Morocco, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, and a few others. According to UN Trade Development reports by UNCTAD, non-tariff measures tend to contribute even more than twice as much as tariffs to overall market access and trade restrictions. So we said we need investment to be able to grow, but then we have both tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. Why tariff barriers? Things to do with levies and taxes may be difficult to deal with because government need money in the immediate term. It's always very surprising to me that we can't just get rid of non-tariff barriers, which are just policies that do not make a lot of sense, that tend to come in the way of business. Either there are rules around local content that have not been properly designed, or there are rules around, quota, around permits, and so on and so forth. So these are important areas for us to address. Ease of paying taxes, for example, it's not great on the continent. On one hand, the continent needs revenue, the continent needs development, needs businesses, but then ease of doing business, it can be very complicated, including paying taxes. So Now, if I narrow down to taxation, governance, and development, of course, every economy, whether developed or underdeveloped or developing or whatever it might be, including emerging and frontier markets, have to deal with, nobody has it, going up every time, right? So you have to deal with so many things. With revenue is not enough. I don't know of any country that says they have enough revenue. America generates about $6 trillion in revenue across all levels of government every year, and they still have deficits. So you have to always manage that. Recurrent expenditure, capital expenditure in terms of infrastructure. You need to address budget deficits. Sometimes there are issues to do with AIDS. Sometimes there are issues to do with debt management, trade, inflation, unemployment, conflicts, sustainable development goals, and overall economic development. So Africa, more specifically, has a small tax base that is also structurally challenged in terms of how we have designed the tax system. Sometimes it tends to appear that African countries place disproportionate burden on the lower class as well as the informal sector. So you hear this often, where the revenue is in the informal sector. And I keep saying, why is it that it's the informal sector that is receiving disproportionate attention when in many countries where they have smaller portion of their economy in the informal sector, actually by policy design, exempt them from many taxes. So there are many countries where the threshold for you to pay personal income tax is more than what a director in a government establishment will earn in a country like Nigeria. So there are many countries where the threshold for registering for VAT is more than the turnover of many small businesses in Africa. So everybody needs to contribute their fair share, but what is fair and what is equitable has to be defined by local context, and it has to be that we do not place unnecessary burdens on our people, particularly the vulnerable households and small businesses. Even before the pandemic, the outbreak of COVID-19, African countries had little fiscal space. So when the pandemic struck, it just amplified the already difficult situation such that there was limited fiscal space for any intervention. We didn't have the money, and we didn't have the luxury of printing money like you would easily do maybe in the United States, for example. So debt started growing faster than GDP, and debt service cost was growing much faster than revenue. If this was a temporary problem, I think it would be fine. But if it's becoming protracted, then it becomes a source for concern. So in terms of International Development Association, non-Nigeria, African countries ended up as 6 out of the top 10 borrowers, according to the World Bank. And that list is led by Nigeria, then Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, and Uganda. Of course, there's really nothing wrong with borrowing, except that you have to be concerned about why you're borrowing and for what purpose is the revenue being applied, and is it being applied in the most judicious manner, especially whether those projects can be self-financing. So just generally, we interest you to know that the debt of the whole world, that is, what are we owing as households, as organizations, and as governments. Interestingly, the debt of the world is $281 trillion as at the end of 2020, which is about 355% of global GDP. If we disaggregate this, the amount that governments are owing is about 105% of GDP around the world. So debt in itself is not bad, but it's the purpose for which it's been applied that matters the most. America, for example, has a debt profile of over $19 trillion, which is 8 times the GDP of Africa and 40 times the aggregate debt of Africa, which is currently around $450 billion. As well, interestingly, America's revenue is also like 13 times the revenue of all the African countries combined, just from taxes alone. Overall, Africa needs to grow fast enough and in an inclusive manner to deliver the scale of development that is desperately needed, because we are youthful, We're growing faster than many other continents, and therefore it will just be a time bomb if we do not do enough and do so very quickly. So in terms of investment opportunities, this information I got from OEC, you can visit the website, and good analysis about what countries export and what they import, and just look at Nigeria there. So main export is mineral products. And the irony, right, the contradiction is that our main import is also mineral products. Why is that? We export crude oil, and then we have to import refined products. So even when the price of crude oil is going up and many oil producing countries are happy, Nigeria is not happy, because we then tend to spend more and have less revenue for governments even when oil prices are high. And this is difficult to understand unless you've done the analysis. Reason being that once you subsidize stuff like petroleum product like PMS, petrol or gas, as they call it in many countries, you then have the incentive for smuggling. People then buy those products in Nigeria, take them across the border to go and resell them, and then the size of the subsidy for government just goes up and it balloons, such that it swallows all the increases in the price of crude oil in the international market. Of course, this is an opportunity for Nigeria to turn around this narrative. I looked at the top 10 countries in Africa, and it was interesting to say that 8 out of those 10 countries, their main import is refined products, but they're not importing those refined products from Africa. Why can't Africa refine their products for consumption within Africa and then export the rest of it? Why should we even be exporting crude oil in the first place? Plus, the world is now moving away from fossil fuel, and we need to start thinking we shouldn't take the back seat again about the conversation in terms of energy transition as well as ESG. Look at South Africa, exports, mostly mineral products as well, gold, diamond, platinum, and then you see the main imports, cars, crude petroleum, refined petrol, and a few others. Here is Egypt, main exports, crude petroleum, refined petroleum as well, then gold, and you see main import, wheat, as well as petroleum gas. And here is Kenya, main export is tea, cut flowers, coffee, and then you see main imports, cars, refined petroleum products. So I just decided to look at the biggest economies in Africa. So just to give an idea in terms of where the opportunities are. So today, these appear to be the challenges that we face, but we can turn them around and they do become opportunities. We have more opportunities in terms of agriculture, services and logistics, industry and manufacturing, as well as technology and entertainment. These opportunities are pockets of opportunities in different places, different locations within Africa. And many of us are very excited about the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is bringing us together, even though slowly but progressively, such that we get to a point in Africa, and I hope very soon, where we can manufacture a car in Africa, and the engine will come from a particular country because they have the competitive advantage and comparative advantage to do it better than anyone else. And the bodies of the design, even the design, the concept will come from another country, the body parts will come from another country, and the aesthetics and the interior will come from another country. Let 5 African countries produce the best cars and sell to Africa and the rest of the world. Today, Airbus, is the largest airplane manufacturer in the world, and it's in Europe, and it's done by a number of countries. Even the jet engine, the wings are done by different countries. So we have to be united for the interest of our continent and that of the world. So how do we connect the dots? So the reason why revenue is low and government is borrowing and debt is rising and we don't have enough investment for infrastructure and human capital development, a key component of that is low tax revenue base, because revenue from tax is the only source of revenue to government that is sustainable, not revenue from crude oil, not revenue from diamond or gold. So why is it that revenue is low in Africa? I would say that, of course, Africa is not homogeneous. We have so many countries, over 54, I think 56 officially. Many of them are doing okay, but many are also struggling. So this is a case study of Nigeria being the largest economy in Africa, where tax to GDP ratio is one of the lowest in the world. And so is government spending to GDP is the second lowest in the world, I think only behind Haiti. So which means Nigeria has no revenue and Nigeria has no money to spend. And this story is not very dissimilar for many other countries in Africa. So in one of my many roles, I had the opportunity to share a roundtable study for the Nigerian Economy Summit Group, and we got some support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we conducted a national study about tax morale, which is really your belief that it's okay to comply with taxes and that evasion is wrong. That's really what tax morale is about, your willingness to comply with taxes and the belief that tax evasion is wrong. We were, even those of us who live in the country, were surprised at the very low level of tax morale in the country, where many Nigerians do not pay their taxes and they do not think that tax evasion is wrong. In fact, only 17% of adults think that tax evasion is wrong. In other words, almost 83% don't see anything wrong with tax evasion. And when we conducted the same study for small businesses and large firms, it was just only slightly better, with only 31% considering it appropriate to pay their taxes as at when due. Of course, there are different factors that have been alluded to low tax morale, including knowledge and complexity of the tax system. What do I get in exchange for the taxes that I pay? What is the social and individual norms of other people that I know? If nobody else is paying taxes, why should I be the only one paying? This can affect your tax morale, as well as legitimacy of government and whether you have trust in government and whether you consider them to be fair to you. And then, of course, not the least is, do you consider yourself to have a voice in how you're being governed? So these issues affect revenue. So why is Africa's debt profile rising? Again, I had the opportunity to share a roundtable by Nigerian Economic Summit Group and OSIWA on debt management for ECOWAS this time around. We're looking at ECOWAS. And you see there in terms of how the debt profile has been growing significantly just over the past 10 years alone, right? So significant from just about $71 billion in 2010 to close to $300 billion now by 2020. And bear in mind, these are very small countries in terms of their economic size. So the global pandemic, affected low-income and emerging economies disproportionately because it impacted their revenue very significantly, while they also needed to spend more to be able to stimulate the economy and to provide palliatives during that very difficult time. According to an IMF report, Africa experienced recession for the first time in 2020 in a period of almost a quarter of a century, 25 years. So foreign direct investments is expected actually decline by 42%, and it's expected that this trend will continue for a little longer because of the lingering uncertainty that is related to the pandemic, including the unfortunate news that we now have a fourth strain. So it doesn't seem like the virus is leaving us alone anytime soon. So many of these revenues are not diversified, single source economies, and there's large informal interventions. Even when you want to try and provide palliatives to poor people, how do you even administer it without politicians hijacking it? Because many of the countries don't have reliable identification system where people have been properly recognized and registered. So, and a lot of these are sometimes disbursed in cash, which means it can easily get stolen by politicians and middlemen. So we also have poorly designed tax system, I already spoke to that. And now we're seeing the debt service to revenue ratio becoming problematic, almost close to 100% or even more than that in some cases, which means your entire revenue is barely enough to service your debt. So the question is, you have to then borrow to pay salaries of civil servants, to provide infrastructure if you're able to provide any. And that just, if it's not controlled, can easily get you into what economics would call the debt trap. So why sustainability matters in all of this is you don't want to have development that is one-off. You don't want to have development at all costs, which is you're gaining, $1 in economic value, but you're killing the future of the country, of the people. You're compromising their standard of living. So according to the United Nations, sustainability is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is really important, cuts across environmental issues, social issues, and governance. So these issues are not limited to the public sector or government or politicians. It cuts across, including private organization, the private sector, multilateral organization, investors, and even individuals in a different capacity. So in linking all of this together, I'll say at the heart of the conversation is governance and sustainability. If you have good governance, growth, even though you will not always grow, nobody has a straight line that goes up at all times, right? Life is life, it's never perfect. But you will find that if you draw the line over a long-term period, it will be upward trending, which means governance actually determines everything else. So we see poor governance, we see conflict, unfortunately, still in Africa, and we see policy challenges where you have policies that are not friendly to investment and to development. And that would then lead to low and undiversified revenue base, including illicit financial flows. So we don't have a lot of money in Africa, but then you have a lot of corrupt leaders who then, misappropriate those funds for themselves. Even in the recent leak, the leak that we had, the Pandora Papers, you still unfortunately find a lot of African politicians on those leaks, and there seem to always not be any consequences. We've heard one or two, world leaders that either have resigned or have been impeached just because of this, but in Africa it seems to be business as usual. Because of budget deficits, you are unable to fund infrastructure. Therefore, infrastructure is poor, which makes human capital development even more difficult. And then the rising debt and high debt service ratio, and so on and so forth. This is the combination, but actually Africa must break the cycle of poor governance, without which sustainable development will remain elusive. So we need to break this cycle. And I think the starting point is from governance. Once you fix that, then I think the rest will follow. There's no doubt that the continent has huge potentials, but we now need to translate all of that into reality for our people. So in closing, we need to improve governance in terms of next steps, diversify our economies and invest in human capital, particularly education and healthcare. It needs to even start trading with itself, and then trade with the rest of the world. We need to provide, for example, African countries don't even have avoidance of double taxation treaties with themselves. Maybe only South Africa has a sizable number of treaties with other African countries. Many African countries don't have. Nigeria and Ghana are the closest countries in terms of trade. They don't even have an avoidance of double taxation treaty. So we are hoping, and some of us are proposing, that even under the African Continental Free Trade Area and the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, we must have a multilateral treaty for Africa that ensures that we eliminate double taxation whenever we are investing in one another's country. We need to provide enabling environment for competitiveness and leverage technology to grow revenue. And then we need to champion a new focus on the broader conversation about the tax system and the social contract. The social contract, I think, is broken, and we need to fix it, and fix it very urgently. So I'll close with this quote by the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She said, "Africa is not poor. It is just poorly managed." But I think it is time to start changing this narrative. And some of these conversations we're having today, I think will help us to move in the right direction, one step at a time. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, TAIWO. That was very informative. And in our discussion, in our roundtable discussion today, we'll touch on a few things you've mentioned so that we get an opportunity to expand and build on them further. So going forward, we can focus on building on those recommendations that you've mentioned. This presentation ties in very well with the discussions from yesterday. It touches on governance, as was mentioned. It touches on GDP growth that was mentioned yesterday, and policy negotiations to improve and transform partnerships that Africa makes. And I think there will be questions and a need to discuss some points further. So thank you very much for that.